A person controls what they can, but what they can't control, they entrust to God. This feeling actually brings comfort to people. They fulfill their own responsibilities, and if there are situations they can't handle, by entrusting them to God, they can find relief.
Related to this, there's the issue of spiritual counseling and guidance, which has become very popular lately. Could you talk a bit about this? What is spiritual counseling?
Of course, we know that human beings have a biological side, a psychological side, and a social side. They also have a spiritual side, and people, more often, when they experience any kind of problem, start to feel a need for meaning. Life is like a long journey with its ups and downs. Sometimes there are beautiful moments, sometimes there are troubled times, and during these difficult periods, people seek support from many different sources. They manage these coping processes by getting help from those who have been through similar things. And they try to overcome the problems they are facing. Of course, we know that human beings have a biological side, a psychological side, and just as they have a social side, they also have a spiritual side, and people, more often, when they experience any kind of problem, start to feel a need for meaning. And they search for meaning more intensely. They question it when they face problems. The main reason for this, actually, is that people they feel the absence of what they value much more, especially in situations where they experience a loss of meaning. So, most of the time, these are the difficult periods when they experience problems. In such situations, they tend to become a bit more spiritual. They may start questioning things in the spiritual realm, the meaning of life, the state of the world, the afterlife, the spiritual side, the transcendent dimension. They tend to question these things more. And during this process, they may refer to religious and spiritual elements. Of course, this can happen in many different ways. Some people mostly seek support from a spiritual realm, turning to religion, performing acts of worship. She has transcended her own experiences into a transcendent realm, relying on the existence and oneness of God and trying to overcome it through worship and prayers. Of course, some people may also experience losses during this process. That is, when it comes to faith, they may question their own experiences, beliefs, and thoughts. And this can sometimes distance them a bit more from religion and spirituality. It can push them away. But here, in general, we talk about the 5 main functions of religion in an individual's coping processes. One of these is the function of consolation. So the person actually experiences that. By interpreting those experiences, they can find comfort. Because, let's say, imagine we've lost someone we love. With this, we will reunite with them in the afterlife, or that we remain in a kind of communication with them through prayers or by reciting the Quran can help us heal, bring us comfort, and make it easier for us to cope. At the same time, it also gives us a sense of control. Religious and spiritual elements. Because when a person is trying to cope with a problem, they might feel like they've lost control, and this disturbs the person. But for example, the message of religion. The idea that with every hardship comes ease, as described in Surah and Shira, for instance, this message actually helps people. Cognitive control. It can provide that, when you think of it as an automatic way of thinking. It can offer healing and relief.
It also offers a sense of hope.
It definitely gives a sense of control, and that's exactly what the belief in tawakkul is. In other words, a person controls what they can, but what they can't control, they entrust to God. This feeling actually brings comfort to people. They fulfill their own responsibilities. And by entrusting situations they can't overcome to God, they can find relief. Another factor is social support. After all, believers support one another. Of course, this support may decrease from time to time, but in the end, believers help each other and provide social support. And this social support can also strengthen people in a religious and spiritual sense. There is also a function we can call maturation, fostering, and development. Because what we go through actually helps us grow. The things we experience happen to us to help us grow, to make us more mature. And becoming aware of this, realizing it, can help a person mature. We can talk about the effect of religion in the coping process in these 5 dimensions.
You mentioned social support here. Everyone may need some help or support in situations like this. Related to this, there's also the issue of spiritual counseling and guidance, which has become very popular recently. Could you talk a bit about this? What is spiritual counseling?
As you said, spiritual counseling and guidance is something that's been talked about a lot lately. It's mostly a service provided by the Directorate of Religious Affairs in Turkey under their authority. In fact, in addition to religious services, the Directorate of Religious Affairs provides these services. The Directorate offers these services. So, what is meant by spiritual counseling and guidance? It's actually an umbrella term. It's generally referred to as religious and spiritual counseling and guidance. But in reality, it's a general framework name for the services that the Directorate provides to disadvantaged individuals in many institutions. We can think of it this way, because it's different in each case. In different institutions, it goes by different names. For example, in hospitals, since the word care is commonly used in the hospital system, the term spiritual care is preferred. In KYK dormitories or youth centers, since guidance is a bit more prominent, it's sometimes called spiritual guidance. In the military, for example, the term morale is used more often. The word officer is also more commonly preferred. In prisons, the term prison preacher takes the place of spiritual counseling. As I mentioned, it's actually a bit of an umbrella concept. And depending on the institution where spiritual counseling and guidance are provided, this name can appear under different titles.
The word spiritual itself seems to make people a bit uneasy. Depending on the context, people can debate why it's called spiritual. And of course, since it has a somewhat religious perspective, it can be interpreted in different ways.
Of course, this is, religious counseling. This debate has also been widely discussed in academic circles. But in Turkey, there is a unity between religion and spirituality. So, unlike in the West, religion and spirituality aren't completely separate things here. That's why I think the term spiritual counseling can be used more comfortably in Turkey. Since this is also the general consensus, it's accepted as spiritual counseling. Actually, it also includes religious counseling, because in the environments where this service is provided, let's say in hospitals or prisons, the people, the clients, or those being addressed, also fulfill their need for religious knowledge. Actually, so that would include religious counseling. It has a location and it has content. That's what spiritual counseling is.
Actually, we see this in the West as well. How does this situation arise in the West? Yes, in our country, spiritual and religious counseling might be seen as the same thing. They can also be understood as the same concept. How is this reflected in the West? Could you explain spiritual counseling a bit, also mentioning its historical development?
Yes, there are also many different names for it there. Each country has its own examples, own conditions, and actually there are various different practices. But there too, spiritual counseling, religious counseling, in other words, Terms like spiritual counseling or religious counseling are more commonly used in English-speaking cultures, or in German, terms like Seelsorge are used. This is described with different concepts. But the main point is that providing religious and spiritual support in institutions is actually spiritual counseling. Because when we define spiritual counseling, it is the professional support of individuals' coping processes and times with spiritual and religious elements. In fact, that's what spiritual counseling is. So, let's say in prisons, or hospitals, or rehabilitation centers, during disasters, in emergencies, or, for example, think about supporting children or supporting people and families who have experienced loss. In these kinds of difficult situations, a professional form of support that can provide this, a complementary form of support, is actually spiritual counseling. So how does this emerge in Europe? Actually, in the religious traditions. At their core, it's something that exists in the theological structure, meaning it's what the founders of that religion or the people representing that religion used to do. Because, for example, when we look at the life of the Prophet in the Islamic world, we can find examples of this. Because when the Prophet conveyed the verses of the Quran to people, he did so with an understanding of those counseling principles in a beautiful way. He did this with wisdom, taking care of each companion individually and concerning himself with their troubles. He takes care of them one by one. He visits the sick, looks after orphans. If there is someone in need, he takes care of them and provides that support. But of course, once the process of urbanization began and people started living within larger institutions, in big metropolises, he had to live. That's why this spiritual counseling service is more professional. It needs to be provided, because in the past, think about it this way. For example, in a small village, the imam was already doing this. I mean, let's say Uncle Mehmet didn't come to the mosque. What happened? He would ask. If he was sick, he would visit him. If he had a wedding, he would go to his wedding, or if he had any kind of trouble, he would reach out and offer support. But in the city, there's no such thing. There's a need to do this in a more professional way, through institutions. And that need has arisen. This is, in a way, a result of that. In other words, as a result of modern life and the process of urbanization, spiritual counseling has emerged. And as a result of this, today we are faced with such a concept and such a practice.
This urbanization process you're talking about isn't actually something new. It's something that's been happening for a long time. So why has the need for spiritual counseling emerged right now? So what psychosocial situations make this necessary? What has caused this need? That's what we're discussing right now.
So when you look at the West, you actually see the 1800s. Urbanization processes were happening in the mid-1800s. And by the end of the 1800s, we see practices similar to spiritual counseling in the West. Why is it different in our country? If you ask why this happened here, of course, psychology and guidance and psychological counseling, PDR, happened much later, in Turkey. And our urbanization processes started after the 1950s, and these problems started to emerge around that time as well. Maybe. That's why we experience this a bit later and become familiar with it later on. I think.
So, what is the human perspective in spiritual counseling? How do they see people? How do they define them?
Of course, the human perspective in spiritual counseling is actually a holistic point of view, a comprehensive approach. It envisions humans as beings with a biological side, a psychological side, a social side, but also a spiritual side. And when someone experiences problems in their spiritual side, their psychological state is also affected, or their social side can also be affected. That's why it operates with the idea and initial assumption that people need to be supported spiritually as well, especially during coping processes and difficult times.
So, what can you say about spiritual counseling today and about spiritual counseling in our country? Professor, right now, it is more closely related to the field of theology. What is the current situation? How are these efforts going?
Spiritual counseling is, of course, a discipline of many kinds. It's an interdisciplinary field. It draws from both psychology and psychiatry, as well as psychological counseling and social work. And it also benefits from theology. And it has this interdisciplinary structure, and it's being designed with content that encompasses all of these fields. In our country, of course, the Directorate of Religious Affairs manages this. Is managing more. Except for spiritual counseling in the military, all institutional spiritual counseling is carried out by personnel from the Directorate of Religious Affairs. What kinds of practices do we have in our country? Currently, spiritual counseling in hospitals has been ongoing for a long time. There are apps. For example, it started in 2015. There are spiritual counseling practices in prisons as well, which actually go back as far as the 1980s. There are also spiritual guidance services for young people in KYK dormitories. And there are spiritual counseling services for the elderly in nursing homes. Spiritual counseling services are also provided in rehabilitation centers, even though the numbers aren't very high. In the fight against addiction, spiritual counseling and guidance services are used, because each of these areas requires its own specialized training. For example, people working in hospitals need to understand patient psychology, the hospital environment, and the situations of both patients and their relatives. They need to receive both relevant training and counseling education. Or, for example, if they're going to work in prisons, they need to be trained in criminal psychology, the psychology of offenders, and how to deal with the families of offenders. Similarly, in the case of addiction, they need to receive this kind of training as well. So, depending on the institution where they work, they need to get different types of training. There are such practices in Turkey. Recycling is also very good, really good, because people like this. People don't feel alone in these kinds of environments, and seeing that their coping processes are being supported makes them happy. And people gain benefits both in terms of health and also spiritually. This is spiritual counseling. They benefit.
Actually, I wanted to ask about the training, but you already explained it, Professor. Because for a spiritual counselor to work in the areas you mentioned, they need to be well versed in both psychological and sociological training. Of course, this will vary depending on the institution. Depending on which institution they're in, they'll need to go through different types of training. Do you think these trainings are provided sufficiently? Are there separate trainings for each field?
Yes, so, in the beginning, it was mostly those who did their masters in fields like the psychology of religion or the sociology of religion. But later on, in our country, master's programs in spiritual counseling and guidance master's degrees were opened. And as far as I know, there are about 25 universities with these departments, and after a master's program, you can access these trainings. When you look at the content of these trainings, they mainly include counseling skills, communication techniques, techniques for understanding individuals, and courses that mostly fall under the field of counseling, like empathetic listening techniques. And there are also courses that cover the field of religion and mental health, as well as religious coping. And this process is also explained by experts. Teach counseling and oversee the supervision process. These applications are, of course, better than high-stakes applications. But in addition to this, spiritual counseling training is sometimes provided through certificates and in-service training courses. So many different forms, but as I mentioned earlier, the best method is through a graduate-level program, with the help of SANS and including consultancy skills. so that it is provided as a graduate education. In addition, in our country, spiritual counseling is not only provided to theology graduates. In some guidance and psychological counseling (PDR) departments, spiritual counseling courses have been added to the curriculum, and in theology faculties, they are also offered as elective courses. Spiritual counseling. Actually, we need to think about it like this. We should see it as something that complements and enhances religious services. Spiritual counseling. Otherwise, it is not an alternative to guidance and psychological counseling, psychology, or psychiatry. On the contrary, those processes. It will also help people overcome their problems related to psychology and psychiatry, as well as their prejudices about those fields. In fact, it also has an aspect that makes it easier for people to go through psychological and psychiatric treatment processes. I think it has a complementary role in the system. Spiritual counseling, that is, if it is done properly, without anyone experiencing role confusion and in accordance with the rules, spiritual counseling is a field of work that I believe could have great benefits in our country, especially in the area of mental health and community mental health.
Actually, there's a debate about whether this falls within the domain of psychologists, but you've clarified that as well.
Of course, it doesn't actually fall within the domain of psychologists, because spiritual counselors are given psychopathology information. So, they do know about psychopathology. They know about the field of psychopathology, but they don't actually practice in the field of psychopathology, because that's the job of specialists, clinical psychologists, and psychiatrists. They don't get involved in that area. They refer people when necessary, because if a client comes to them with this kind of problem, they can refer them to the appropriate places so they can receive proper treatment. And they can offer this kind of advice to them. So I see it as a field that supports the process, not one that undermines it. That's how I see it. I do this.
Well, thank you very much, Professor, for your valuable insights. Once again, it was very enlightening. We had the chance to take a broad look at the issue of spiritual counseling and guidance. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Dear viewers, we talked about spirituality, counseling, and guidance today. See you in the next episode. Goodbye.